Thank you very much again for coming. My name is Dr. Reuven Sussman of the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Sometimes we just call it ACEEE because it's kind of a mouthful. I'm here with Maxi Chicumbo, our communications associate, and we're physically here in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that works to advance energy efficiency policies, programs, technologies, investments, and behaviors. To learn more about ACEEE's work, check out our website at aceeee.org. I'm the director of the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at ACEEE, which means that I lead research on human behavior and energy efficiency, as well as co-chairing the annual Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, or BECC. BECC's a unique conference in that it brings together individuals who don't always have the opportunity to share knowledge, such as researchers, policymakers, utility program implementers, and businesses focused on energy and behavior. And we all aim to achieve actionable climate solutions. So last year's conference was a resounding success with 540 attendees, a suite of excellent speakers and presenters, and great networking and social activities. The program was excellent with 6 plenaries, 42 general conference sessions, and more than 200 speakers selected through a competitive abstract process. Attendees, about half of whom were new to the conference, came from 37 states and 17 foreign countries. They represented utilities, governments, research firms, nonprofits, consulting groups, and universities. Almost 60 of the attendees were students, including grad students and postdocs, many joining as BECC Fellows under the Competitive Scholarship Program. BECC's now in its 13th year, and it's co-convened by UC Berkeley, Stanford University, and ACEEE. Since its inception, we've helped spark the creation of companion conferences in Europe and Japan. And this year, we've started a webinar series. Well, actually, that was last year we started it. To present this research throughout the year. We're especially excited for BECC 2020 because the conference takes place just after the 2020 election in December. Whatever the outcome, BECC will be ready to lend a hand in showing how behavioral science can play a role in crafting policy and programs to achieve a sustainable and equitable energy future. Today we present the second in our 2020 webinar series. And I just want to note that next month we also have a very exciting webinar featuring Ashley Willens, an associate professor at Harvard, who will be talking about transportation behavior change, which is an important topic as well. So if you're interested in that, check out the BECC website. Of course, we'd love to see you at this year's BECC conference, which is taking place in Washington, D.C. from December 6th to 9th. And the call for abstracts is now open. The deadline for submitting a 300 individual or panel abstract is April 1st. So just a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode. Following our speakers' remarks, we'll open up the webinar to questions. Throughout the presentations, please type your questions into the chat box, and we'll work to address them during the Q&A period. So Maxine is here. She's on standby, waiting to take your questions. So please, as they come up, just type them into the chat box, and we'll get to them after the webinar, or after our speakers finished. Finally, the webinar is being recorded, and we will send you the link after the webinar is done, so you don't have to furiously write down everything you hear. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Arlene Burt. Arlene is founder and chief visual storyteller of Background Stories at backgroundstories.com. Arlene works with environment-focused organizations in the US, EU, and UK to translate complex ideas, systems, and metrics into clear visuals that help people, especially non-experts, understand sustainability. An expert in information visualization and narrative, visual storytelling for sustainability, Arlene develops creative community engagement and integrates behavior change principles into her work. Arlene's also a professor at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, teaching courses on information design, data visualization, and sustainability since 2008. She's a climate reality leader. I'd like to hear more about what that means, and is always on the lookout for opportunities to create participatory, data-focused public artwork. Today's webinar is on how to visually translate your research data for greater engagement and impact. This was featured as a workshop at last year's BECC and received excellent response. Thank you, Arlene, for leading today's webinar. I'm going to now transfer you control so you can flip through your slides at your leisure.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
One moment here. Okay. I've now made you the presenter, so you should be able to take control.
Great. Are you seeing my first slide?
We're seeing it.
Great. Okay, well, thanks for having me. I like to start, well, I just first a couple seconds on BECC. I've had the privilege to attend the past couple of years, and I really enjoy it as a conference. A lot of the insight I gain about behavior change and implementing this type of work is really a valuable asset from there. So I encourage everyone to make it if you can. I'd like to start off with this question. So what do you think? People following directions with illustrations, what percentage better than those following text directions alone? What percentage better do they do in terms of following those instructions? So just guess for yourself, and then so this is the answer. It's actually 323% better, so over 3 times better. And typically a lot of people are amazed by this, but I think this really goes to show that visuals are a very powerful part of our communication language in a way. And that might be one of the reasons why visuals are highly prominent also in emergency type situations, such as flight emergency instructions. Another question, so if you can think for yourself of what percentage of the population do you think are actually data literate? And we'll define data literacy as the ability to read, understand, create, and communicate data as information. So which percentage? Well, it's according to a small study done in 2017, 17% are data literate. Another study, this was done in the US, 32% of C-suite leaders, so business leaders like CEOs, CFOs, et cetera. To me, this is a little bit concerning that both the general population has fairly low data literacy, as well as especially leaders of large companies and organizations are relatively low on data literacy. So I think we all can agree that data should be visual to help facilitate some of this understanding. Here's a quick example. These 4 sets of data, can you maybe picture what's the difference between these 4 sets of data here? So for me, as a visual person, it's really hard to understand this. My eye is drawn to all of the point O's because that's the pattern that emerges for me, the visual pattern. But of course, that's the least significant part of the data set. So when we visualize this, it's much more easy to see very quickly at a glance where are the outliers, what's the trend, etc. I can go more into this. We're going to skip over this for a moment. But if you're interested, you can email me after this and I'll send you this is kind of a tip sheet for what common types of graphs to use to show which type of data based on your objective. And this is definitely something that there are different types of graphs that make more sense in different scenarios. So I encourage you to look a little more into this. And again, I'm happy to share this with anybody who's interested. We do know, of course, that data alone is not enough. A quote from Doug Mackenzie Muir, author of Fostering Sustainable Behavior, is that information campaigns alone will rarely bring about behavior change. So for me, as a young graphic designer, this was really influential for me, that I realized, oh, what do you mean? I can't just make it look good and have people, change their behaviors. We know it's a lot more complicated than that. We need to engage emotions. Facts and information don't activate the emotional centers of our brain that actually cause us to take action. And even Plato has said that human behavior itself flows from these 3 main sources: desire, emotion, and knowledge. So the information that goes into becoming knowledge is just a part of really creating behavior change. Information itself only becomes meaningful to the extent that it evokes emotion. So maybe we can pause for a moment and just think about what are some of the ways, we know we need to establish this emotional connection. What are some of the ways in your daily life that you feel emotion? A lot of times people say music, listening to the radio or driving in the car and listening to music. Movies, films often evoke strong emotions from people, certainly from me. Another idea is stories, what you hear from other people. And the interesting thing about stories is that hearing a story actually activates parts of your brain so that the listener turns the story into their own experience. So if someone tells me the story of a child being hurt in a car accident, I instantly feel that because I imagine my own daughter being hurt in a car accident. So being able to communicate stories can help people emotionally connect to the message that you're trying to communicate. So we've talked about data should be visual and that data should tell a story. So let's group these things together. Let's talk about it as data visual storytelling. This is not necessarily a new topic. Visual storytelling has been around for eons, from cave paintings. Also, this is an example from the Renaissance cathedrals. The stained glass windows weren't just to look nice, bringing color into the space, but it was also, they incorporated little illustrations, vignettes of the stories that were being taught about in the church. And that was primarily for illiterate parishioners, so they couldn't read, but there were reminders of the stories in the windows themselves. And this is another famous example about that a lot of us data visual storytellers use, Napoleon's March. So this, now, before we dig into this, I could show you the same information in a different way. So I could say, all right, this is Napoleon's 1812 campaign to capture Moscow. Here's the number of soldiers at the start and the end of the campaign. So you can clearly see here that a lot of soldiers perished during the campaign, but we don't really know what this is about, right? This just tells us one piece of data. I could maybe add a second piece of data in here about soldiers arriving and departing Moscow. And now you see that, oh, that's interesting. It's roughly the same number. So this does start to bring up more questions for us, but we're still missing a lot of information. And this information is, I feel, what sharing the context can really put your data sets into a bigger picture so that your audience can better understand them. So this as an example of that bigger picture, where we see on the left-hand side, the soldiers departing Poland. The beige is them marching across. Moscow's in the upper right-hand corner. And the black lines are, the black bar are the retreating soldiers. So you start to see a much clearer picture of what's happening. And actually this particular visualization integrates 5 different variables, including temperature, geographic distribution, as well as the date. So one thing that's particularly interesting about this is we start to see that on the 28th of November, right here by this river, in the middle of the screen here where I've zoomed in, it was 20 degrees below, and that's a Muir scale. So I think it's something like 13 degrees below in Fahrenheit. Quite cold, right? And you see the soldiers were fording this river. And of course, at those temperatures in November, not very many made it across. So this visual really starts to show more of a complete story of what happened and the context overall. And putting that data into context helps us more emotionally connect with what was happening to those soldiers, what was happening to the individuals, as well as the big picture story. So in my work, I often encounter these 2 different approaches to communication. The scientists and the technical side of things on the left, we have an indicator that measures, and people get really excited about their measurement and their tool. And then on the right, we have a pair of people that say, well, let me tell you a story. And this is a little bit more humanities approach. And it also happens to align more so with the general population, that we react more emotionally to stories than to the specific indicator or a specific measurement. And I think that's where we need to put those indicators and measurements into context. So my work is kind of at this intersection between communicating social and environmental sustainability, using information and data to do that, and establishing visual and emotional stories to help all of that communication. So we're trying to establish that emotional connection to social and environmental topics. And the big picture of this is, how can we start to visually show stories and connect some everyday experiences like drinking your coffee in the morning to where that comes from, to the big picture behind it, and all the different ways that our everyday actions impact climate and environment. So let's take for an example just this simple pencil. If we were to measure the sustainability of this pencil, we could come up with a lot of different metrics, right? But really, another way to think about it is through the story that those metrics have arrived to us from. So for example, the wood in this pencil comes from a tree. It's a very specific tree in a very specific location. It was cut down with a specific method or tool. Behind that is a whole system of logistics. And even behind that are people. So it all does tie back to people and systems that support things. And that we've just talked about the wood portion of the pencil. We could go into more depth on the paint and the rubber bit and the process by which you sharpen it. Now, within this larger system, we can get really specific about, say, eco-labels. Fair trade is applicable to specifically the people, the human component of this bigger story. FSC is specific to how the tree was grown, how it was, how the forest was, and was it sustainably raised. And of course, Energy Star applies to specific machineries and mechanisms throughout the process, and also as we see it with the end consumer of how we use the pencil, in this case, a pencil sharpener. So I really am inspired by this quote from John Muir, famous environmentalist. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And I really believe that this is where we have a lot of opportunity to share the bigger picture of the projects, the researches that we might be doing, and also point to where specifically our research, our data is making impact on that bigger picture of moving toward sustainability. So with my work with background stories, we aim to communicate the complexity of social and environmental topics to non-expert audiences in an engaging way, so in a visual way. We have a number of different projects. I've pulled a few. I wanted to walk through specifically some examples of the different types and techniques that I feel that you can use, a process for doing this type of work, and also some tactical tips. So these are types of things where a lot of questions I typically get, and I'd love to share with you some of those techniques that I think you can use. Okay, so the examples I'm going to share, and some of these are my own team's work with background stories, and others are other existing work that's out there. So we're going to talk about 3 different categories. The first one showing stories, the second one giving numbers context, and the third one is integrating information, is specifically about installation and physical context. Okay, so showing stories, which is really about showing connection. So this project shows not just that our water comes out of the tap and disappears down the drain, but the full system before and behind that. And of course, we do know that the water cycle, it's a cyclic system as well. So trying to illustrate how it's a bigger picture and continues. Similarly, with the theme of being a cycle, this was a project for a company that does bamboo houseware products, like plates and silverware and things, all out of bamboo. And so on the left, we're going from, this is the origin of that product. So this is the story. This is the life cycle, or the life story of that product, where it's grown and harvested, how it's produced and manufactured. Most of it travels to North America, where it's used, and then it can be composted at the end of its life cycle. And theoretically, that compost then turns back into earth, which in another part of the world can support more bamboo being grown. And you'll notice within this life story of the product, that's where we can start to get specific about the details. So the specific eco-labels that apply to different aspects of the scenario. We could also start to show statistics and other data points within this. And I know a lot of people on the call are energy focused. So this was a project we did at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport that was an interactive installation that reminded people of the backstory, that what happens when you plug an appliance into the outlet, and also reminding people that the power that we use is the same power that has to be generated. So this was interactive in the sense of there are 3 motion sensors on 3 tables in the cafe area. As people sit down at the tables, those motion sensors trigger each one of them 1/3 of the lights behind the overall structure. So you see it getting brighter as more people are sitting at those tables and involved in the space. And another project with this idea of showing stories don't always have to be showing a backstory. They can also be a future focused story, but being carefully curated to walk through what is the start, where's your audience currently at, what do they need to know next, and then what do you want them to act upon or do. This was a project for the city of Minneapolis, trying to communicate the city's comprehensive plan for 2040. So this is a plan that the city does every 10 years, looking 20 years into the future. And so we presented kind of what's happening now, as well as enabling a place where residents and community members could kind of vote on the plan, what parts they liked or didn't like, and also add their own commentary. So the next section I want to comment on briefly is giving numbers context. So of course, there's a lot of ways to do this. I like to start with this relatively simple one, where we see bubbles around the world. So we could have just had kind of a pie chart or a bubble chart without the context, but the thing that adds the context here, and so this is where context can sometimes be fairly simple to implement, is really just that outline, the subtle gray outline of the world in the background, to give some context of where in the world are these things happening. Even something as simple as that starts to make the data more real. Now, of course, we do know that these aren't exact locations on the map. They're two different data sets from different places in Spain. And of course, at the moment, because of the scale, they're taking up most of Europe. So we're not looking for realism. We're looking for just the general context, the general idea. And that's often enough to establish more of a personal connection with the data. This is another example from a project we've done with Cliff Bar on some signage for their pollinator-friendly solar installation that they've installed in their Idaho facility. And you'll notice on the bottom half of this, so this is where we're showing how many times do pollinators need to visit some of the common foods, especially those that go into Cliff Bar products, in order for that particular flower to turn into a fruit. So for example, strawberries, it's more than 20 times a pollinator has to visit that flower. Almonds, 2 to 4 times. So even by showing that, we're reiterating by including the numbers as well, but by showing that, we're trying to communicate more and help people better understand and really almost experience what that might be like and how much it takes for those pollinators. They're very busy pollinators. Another example, putting numbers into context. Sometimes the context is really about sharing different aspects and sharing comparison. So this particular project is an interactive piece where you can hover over either the country or on the left-hand side, there's a percentage of agricultural land, and that changes the information that's on the right half of the screen. So this enables comparison across European countries as well as across individual locations. And sometimes the reason that comparison can help put numbers into context is because maybe I'm not as familiar with, say, organic agriculture in Finland, but I may be more familiar with organic agriculture in Belgium. So I can start to compare how these two things differ. This is, of course, very specific to the audience. So an audience from a different part of the world who's less familiar with these particular countries may not be able to relate as much with the particular data. And that's something I'll get into a little bit later here, is thinking about it's so important to really establish who is your audience and what is the level of current understanding of your audience. And the more specific you can get on those things, the better. So this is another example of putting data into context. Just as some background here, what we work from this particular project is basically a spreadsheet. So we start with just a spreadsheet of information, and we're aiming to show the story behind those numbers. So in this case, this is a visual showing social return on investment. This is not for a general public audience, but I like to share it anyway because I think it does a good job of showing how numbers can become more story focused. So social return on investment is basically what's the return on investment for this particular nonprofit organization in terms of the services they offer, but the benefit to society as a whole. So you see on the left-hand side, the cost per participant. This particular project is, the nonprofit is one that works with people who have formerly been incarcerated and helps them with their work, basically provides them a job, and of course, with payment and everything. And as a result of that, there's a return on investment. The middle column kind of goes through some technical language that people like investors who know a lot about this area that they're looking for, and that's the evidence-based aspect of this. And then the right-hand column is who benefits. So we can actually start to trace those numbers across to benefits to the taxpayer on both local, state, and federal level, as well as those benefits to the individual. And then this is a personal project that I've been working with, which is taking the complex graphs from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, and then trying to provide a little more human context to them. So again, a lot of these, the graphs themselves aren't intended for a general public audience, but my aim is I don't think it necessarily has to be. I think all of us, and everyone in policymaking as well as in technical fields, can benefit from some subtle reminders of how humans interact with this. So this particular project was started last year. So here across the bottom, aligned with this graph, it says a child born today, and that was in 2019, would be 31 years old in 2050 and 81 in, sorry, there's a window in front of that, so I can't quite see that numbers. But anyway, you get the sense of how do humans relate? What's the human scale of this? Even though this is very complex data, maybe it's important for us to remember the human context and how this will impact all of our futures. The idea with showing a child born today, in this case in 2019, was that, now probably the people reading this won't necessarily be born yesterday, so to speak, but they will, maybe they have children of that age, or nieces and nephews, or grandchildren, or just a neighbor recently had a new child. So you start to bring it more into your own personal context where you can have an emotional connection to, gosh, what will it be for this child when they're 81 years old? What will the world be like? Okay, and then the last section I want to give you some examples for is a little bit different. It's more on installation focused work. So physical context. We often find that we're so used to seeing data presented on our screens, on our phones and on our computers. Sometimes we see them printed, but it's so valuable, I think, when we can take that data and present it in a location where the data makes sense. So this particular project was through the school I teach at, the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. This was graphing all 7,600 some students from the history of the college where the data was available. So each string is a year. Each ball is an individual graduate, and they're color coded by the department that they graduated from. So you start to see an ebb and flow over time of where were the different majors, where were people studying, how many were studying. And you can also make this really personally identifiable. So, I mean, it's anonymous data out here, but a graduate could come and say, oh, so that's the year I graduated. I was in the department that's colored blue here. So that ball right there, that could be me. And that makes a much different impression than kind of graphing things on a page. Making it physical and tangible and tactile takes on a new emotional aspect. Another example of this was a project we did in Sweden as well as in the US, was based on data related to studies on the impacts of air quality from reduced car travel, so bicycling. In Sweden, there were these amazing bicycle counters. We see them more and more across the US and North America as well. So on the right-hand side here, we see that 5,436 cyclists passed this point in this particular day. So I thought this was really fascinating, and it's an interesting piece of data, but what does that actually mean? What does that translate to? So sometimes we have to take our data a step further and not just share the results, the amount of carbon emissions avoided, but what does that mean? What does that translate to in terms of quality of life? Or in this case, with this project, we looked at dollar savings. So the fact that 827 cyclists passed this particular point in this day resulted in saving society $8,000, over $8,000. So this was a bicycle counter connected with a projection. So in real time, as cyclists passed by, the projection counted them and illustrated on the nearby wall. And this was done at night, so the projection showed up. It illustrated what that means for society. And another project showing, again, how people can start to react and relate with their own data, but also within the context of a whole. This is a project where we do string surveys and we kind of select certain topics on a Likert scale. So we have 5 or 6 questions on a Likert scale, so a scale of 1 to 10 is your response. And then we ask people to select a color of yarn based on either their age range or their topic of interest, depending on the set of questions that we're asking. And people go through and they respond to these questions. So it's basically a 5-question survey, but the response has been immense. We did this at an art event and people were waiting 20 minutes in line between 9 p.m. and 4 a.m. in order to just respond to the question. It also evoked a lot of conversation. At the end of each of these, we had a tag so people could not only leave their quantitative data in responding to the Likert scale, but also some qualitative aspect if they wished. So there you start to see, this is my string, this is my response and my feeling, and here's within the context of the whole of the people that have responded to this survey. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of inspiration. We could talk all day about these things, and I'm always happy to chat with you to provide some additional examples, but I want to jump now into talking about process for this. An important aspect of this is to not just jump into what does this look like, but to really first understand the story. So developing that story, understanding what data is available, understanding the research, and then structuring the story also with behavior change principles in mind in order to reach that audience. So I wanted to quickly go through an example of showing you what this looks like in terms of the process. So this was an example I showed earlier. You might start to recognize it here in a little bit, but this was the original data sheet. So our first step with this, we're provided the data and we sit down with the analytics team who generated the data, and we start asking a lot of questions. What are these numbers? What do they mean? And most importantly, how are they related to one another? In this process, we're searching for the story. How can we help an audience, in this case, the audience of investors, social investors, how do we help them see this and understand what this actually means that they may be investing in this organization? Throughout this process, we start sketching. So how can we start to show this? As you can see, these are not beautiful sketches. They're not intended for an external audience like, say, a webinar. They're really notes to the designer themselves, trying to say, well, what are some of the different things I could explore in showing this particular data and the story behind this data? At the same time as that, we start thinking about what's the most appropriate graph type for the data. And then once we've landed on that, we start actually working with the data itself. So this is putting the data into the software and generating some of those pieces that go into the end project. We go through several rounds of revisions for this. You also notice here at some point the data actually changes. So we found some mistakes in the data itself and updated those. We're also adding contextual information like labels, small illustrations to help more quickly communicate what the objective of this organization is. And then we add even more contextual information showing some of those SDG goals and other narrative about the organization. So in the end, we end up with something that is visual, it's engaging, but it's especially important that it comes from the data itself. So a few tactical tips. These are common questions I get. A lot of times people ask me, well, what type of image should I use? For example, should I use an icon or a photograph? Now I want you to look for a moment at the photograph and think, what is it you see there? The photograph gets very specific very quickly. So actually with this particular example, it's a tree in New Zealand taken in December. The photograph was taken in December 2005 by a particular person. Now to you, maybe this tree and this image looks like the landscape of where you grew up. Maybe it looks like a local park, or maybe you grew up in a more desert area and this looks nothing like where you grew up at all. So as individuals, we only have our own histories and we have very specific feelings and ideas that we attach to the photographs that we see because they're so close to, quote, reality. it may be close to our reality or it may not be. And that's where an icon is, when you look at the icon, you see, okay, that's meant to indicate a tree, right? With the photograph, you see a lot of other things there, like, oh, maybe it's summer. In this case, it's actually December in Australia and New Zealand. So there's a lot of specifics that come across in photographs that don't come across in icons. So if your objective is to communicate a very specific thing, like a case study or an individual's story, then a photograph is a really great way to go. If your objective is to communicate an overall idea of the benefit of trees around the world for air quality, then maybe think about an icon until you can also pair that with photographs of specific case studies from specific regions. So here's a quick example of this, the Sustainable Development Goals. If we look at Goal 2, Zero Hunger, we could show this many different ways, right, with visuals. It could look like this, it could look like this, or this, or this, and many different others. So you start to see some of the differences between using an icon versus using a photograph. And a side note here, if you're interested in climate-specific photographs, I really highly recommend Climate Visuals. This website and the team behind it has done research oriented around how people perceive photographs related to climate mitigation and solutions, as well as adaptation. So I highly recommend you take a look at that, specific about climate. Okay, the next tip I want to breeze through is all about audience. A lot of times people forget this. They think, oh, let's make this look good. But really the most important aspect of making it look good is to think, well, who is your audience? Who are you trying to gain their attention on this topic? What's their current level of understanding? What are their values? You really have to build from where they are in terms of shaping the message. So someone who's a policymaker may have a similar understanding as the general public, or they may not. That's something you really need to evaluate for your own situation. Now, a lot of times the clients that we work with say, well, we want everyone to be our audience. We want everyone to understand this message. And I agree. I mean, we want, when it comes to communicating social and environmental topics, especially related to behavior change, we do want everyone to be making changes. But the reality is, if you're trying to speak to everyone, you're basically reaching no one. So you want to get as specific as you can in an audience, knowing that it's not that just that audience will benefit. If I am trying to reach policymakers on a specific message, it's not that no one else will be able to understand it, but by really focusing on what those policymakers need, I'm much more likely to really have it reach them and pull on their heartstrings. And that will also mean that other people across different audiences and across the general public will also be influenced by that. But if I don't really try to pull the heartstrings of one very specific audience, I'm much more likely to have it be less appealing to any audience. Okay, and another quick tip, what media should I use? And these, I won't go through these in depth, but there are definitely different uses for different types of media. In general, we try to not be focused on the media until after we really understand the audience, the message, as well as the budget. So a lot of these things, if you go interaction or animation, they tend to take more budget than, say, an infographic. And then I'm just wrapping up. So I wanted to leave you with a few resources, things that I've mentioned in the presentation, as well as some other good places to start if you're interested to look more into how to communicate data and narrative through visuals. So all of these things I highly recommend, and also feel free to reach out to me for additional future recommendations. So I will wrap up there. I think we're pretty much on time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Arlene. That was really engaging and really interesting. Fantastic visuals and really excellent ideas. Maxine has been receiving a few questions on the chat box. I urge anybody who has questions to please put them into the chat box, and we will read them as we get them. So Maxine, what are some folks asking?
So Arlene, we have a lot of people who are curious to know which, I know you just showed a slide with resources, but which software programs you used to create some of the visuals that you've been showing us?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a firm believer that it's not so much the software that's important. I think a good designer, a person that understands how humans perceive visuals and how we perceive space and words on a page as well as numbers on a page, you really don't necessarily need to be tied to a specific program. We can do a lot across a lot of different programs. That said, most designers working in this space tend to use some of the Adobe software, such as we do a lot in Adobe Illustrator, sometimes InDesign if it makes sense for longer publications. But Adobe is kind of the big one in the world of design.
Thanks, Arlene. Do we have any other?
Sorry, there's a couple coming in here.
I can ask a question in the interim. I was wondering, given that this is we like to talk a lot about behavior, do you know if any of these sorts of data visualization strategies, art exhibits, and other kinds of interactive designs may have been tested in a sort of systematic way to change people's behaviors as opposed to just changing their attitudes and ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think much more research is needed in this area. I have seen some research, so there are some resources out there. I think an interesting thing when we think about creativity and culture is that we can certainly test it. We can move something a few pixels to the right or enlarge a logo 15% larger or change a color scheme from a blue to a green, and we can test those things, right? I think some of the value in creativity is actually that we can make larger leaps, not just changing the color scheme, but what happens if we do something totally different than that? And that can be harder to kind of scientifically test because we're looking at wild leaps versus kind of A versus B versus C scenarios. My own feeling is I'm a very strong believer in that evidence base. And I'm also a believer in the power of human creativity, and that we are at this point in time where we need to make some of these big leaps and test out big changes because we just frankly don't have the time to iterate, moving pixels toward testing out changing sustainable behaviors. So I don't mean to say like we need the research, yes, and we also need to not get too stuck on we have to have the research before we can take some risks. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that comes across in the way I'm intending.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, and thank you. I appreciate the answer. Maxine, do we have any other questions?
Yes, I have another question here. Does your team ever interact with intended audience through focus groups and surveys when you're designing visual stories in addition to your client?
Yes, I'm glad that was asked. And yes, we really enjoy those scenarios. I think it's very important to test things out on that audience. Unfortunately, in a lot of our work, it's often the first thing that's cut from the budget, which is very frustrating sometimes for us, where we want to be doing more of that scientific-based testing. But regardless, we do run things past other people, regardless what we're doing. But ideally, it involves upfront in the project talking to some of that intended audience members and understanding how they see the situation. As visual thinkers, we actually get a lot of inspiration from the different words people use to describe the same thing. Those differences in the words gives us a lot of inspiration in terms of how we visualize the content. So yes, interacting with that core audience, the target audience, is a very important part of this work. And unfortunately, I think too often these types of projects are going toward a specific outcome, like, hey, we need a report designed, and they're less focused on, so therefore they don't often include the budget to really test it out thoroughly.
Okay, we have another question. Do you have a way of measuring and assessing the behavior change impact of these data visualizations?
I would love to. I'd love to talk more about possibilities to do that. A lot of what we do is based on other research that has been done before. A lot of actually graphic design principles are based on studies on how people perceive differences in sizes and shapes. So for example, actually humans, we perceive area really badly. We have a hard time understanding area in terms of quantity. So therefore, then I might go off on a tangent here, but therefore things like pie charts are actually are really hard for us humans to compare data across different slices of the pie chart, because the slices of the pie chart are all oriented in different ways and they're different area sizes. The pie chart is structuring the quantity based on showing a different area, and humans have a hard time perceiving that. So as a side tip, we do try to encourage using stacked bar graphs whenever possible. Now, I know it's not as interesting of a shape. Often we're drawn to pie charts because it's a circle, and so much of our world is rectangular or linear. So it's nice to see a circle on the page sometimes. But if you're actually going for the comparison of the data, the comparison of the slices of the pie chart, a pie chart is not necessarily the best way to visualize that. So I'm not sure if I totally answered that question, but there is some research out there, especially related to how humans perceive visuals and layout and space.
Okay, another question here. This person says there's so much disinformation around climate and energy efficiency on social media. Is it better to tell an emotional story to connect or to refute the bad or misleading information? Is one more effective than the other, positive versus corrective?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I have a hard line answer for you. I think, I guess in general with our work, we tend to support more the positive focus messages. I've definitely seen, research kind of that could go either way. So I would love to see more of a summary study that analyzes all of the different research that's out there specifically on that topic. Though I haven't seen too much of it at this point in time. I think it is really interesting when you start to look at what's the most important way to connect with that audience. And does the audience themselves react better to a positive message or to a corrective measure? So maybe thinking through that specific to that audience may help you make a decision on which may make the most sense for your particular project.
Okay, I think we have a couple of students online because there's some questions about, I know earlier we asked you about resources for creating the infographics, but what about online courses as far as kind of an introduction to data visualization? Would you recommend anything?
Yeah, take any course that's out there, I guess. There's so many resources. Data visualization is a relatively new field. So it's relatively meaning, the past 20, 30 years or something. So in the big picture of things, it's relatively recent. There are a number of programs that are starting up. I can't remember off the top of my head specifics about that, but feel free to follow up with an email and I can give some of those resources to you. I know there are some courses online, like through Lynda, which I think may have changed its name when it was bought by LinkedIn. There's also a lot of books out there. There's a lot of work in this community of data visualization. And I see more and more that's focused specifically on communicating climate-related topics.
I think it's now called LinkedIn Learning.
Okay, thank you. Yes, LinkedIn Learning. We do at MCAD, so the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, we also offer a few courses on sustainable design, and then at least one of those is specific to visual storytelling and data visualization.
Okay, give me a second. So this question is about, I guess, your process. How do you get feedback on your initial sketches and concepts?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that. I'm a firm believer in sketching, and I also prefer to share those initial rough sketches with a client, because then I feel like we can have conversations about the content itself, versus the minute I put something into the computer, it's perceived as being relatively finished, even if it's not. Even if I say this is a draft, we're only 30% of the way there in terms of visual look and feel. Our perception is, well, all the lines are straight and clean, so it looks like it must be closer to finished. So in terms of our process, we really advocate for a lot of back and forth, because me and my team are not necessarily, we're not the content experts, and we really need the input from the content experts to make sure that we're visualizing things in the most relevant and appropriate way. So to do that, we start by sharing our sketches. Then once we can be certain that the content is on track and heading in the right direction, then we start to put it into the computer, if that's the particular implementation, look and feel that we're going for, and then work through revisions of the illustration or graphics and content.
Okay, and when you're handling the data, do you have any recommendations about how to indicate uncertainty or margins of error?
Yes, that's another question I get asked a lot. There are definitely visual techniques to share that, and there's a lot we could, again, it's highly dependent on the particular context of the margin of error. There's some visual techniques we can use, like showing gradients of where it's more probable versus less statistically significant. There are other things you can do with just kind of subtly highlighting where the emphasis should be, where the highest probability is. With visuals, and if we think about visuals as a language, I mean, it is. We perceive a large portion of our world through seeing. When we start to think about it as a language, there becomes a lot of nuance that you can start to use. So by having something bold and black as text and large, then that becomes much more noticeable on a page than something that can be lighter gray, thinner text, and smaller. And so as we develop visuals, we start to think about the ways we can layer the information. What do we want this audience to see first? And that's bold and black text, thick lines, so you see it first. And the smaller notes are things you see as you spend more time with the visual. And I do think that there's a lot of opportunity within those smaller notes, highlighting the details, to start to show how to put that into the context of what's the level of probability and what's the range of statistical significance or whatever we're trying to highlight.
All right, well, while we ask the last question, I'm just going to bring up a different visual here, just to remind you all about the BECC conference, and then we'll take this last question, and then we will sign off. Maxine?
Okay, so last question. Do you have any studies or evaluations that have attempted to quantify the impact of visual storytelling versus other methods?
There are a few studies out there, again, related to visuals, not as much specific to this visual storytelling, or what I talk about as being visual storytelling. There are a number of things looking at narrative visualization and different methods related to that. Again, it's something I see much more research needed in the area, and I think there's a lot of potential for it. So I'd love to see more partnerships between people studying these things from a social science and scientific perspective, as well as with creative designers and visualizers.
Great. Well, that is, I mean, it's been a pleasure having you. Your talk is really interesting, and your area of focus is really important. So thank you very much. For those who haven't got their questions answered, we are going to send your question on to Arlene so she can address them in an email if that helps. Also, I encourage you to go to backgroundstories.com to get more information about Arlene's services. And I just wanted to remind you again that within the next day, we'll send you the link of the recording, and please register for next month's webinar on transportation behavior change with Ashley Willens, an assistant professor at Harvard. The webinar registration is, of course, available on the BECC website under the Webinars tab. Be sure to check out the BECC conference, and we are accepting abstracts now. So if you have something along these lines at the nexus of energy and behavior and climate change, please go to the website and submit a 300-word abstract before April 1st. Just search Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference or go to the BECCconference.org. So thank you very much. We're going to sign off now and have a great rest of your day.